Welcome to The 5 Books, where each week we talk with a Jewish author about 5 books that are near and dear to them. My name is Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen, and today I'll be talking with Jason Diamond about Kaplan's Plot, a novel about intergenerational trauma and the Jewish gangsters of the 1920s, inspired by a discovery Jason made about his own family.
I found it used book about the Jewish gangsters of Chicago, and there's this picture of this guy named Yitz Kaplan. But I'm like, oh, I had a great uncle with that name. And I flipped to the next page, and there's a picture of Yitz Kaplan, and his brother was my great-grandfather. And my great-grandfather wasn't a gangster, and neither was Yitzhak, but they needed money. They were poor. They were immigrants.
Jason Diamond has written for The New York Times, The New Yorker, Esquire, Harper's Bazaar, The Wall Street Journal, McSweeney's, NPR, and many other outlets. He's the author of The Sprawl and the memoir Searching for John Hughes. He's the co-author with Nicholas Heller of New York Nico's Guide to NYC. Today we'll be discussing his debut novel, Kaplan's Plot. The book is about Elijah Mendes, a man who returns to Chicago after his tech business fails and discovers that his family owns a Jewish cemetery and that a man he's never heard of, his great-uncle Solomon Kaplan, is buried in a plot there. As he untangles his family's story, the narrative weaves between Elijah's present-day relationship with his mother Eve and the story of his grandfather, Yitz Kaplan, a Jewish gangster in 1920s Chicago. In this episode, Jason shares how reading Art Spiegelman's Mouse taught him to cope with his family's silence about their past.
Reading Mouse at such an early age, it just kind of made me understand sort of early on, like, I have to be willing to accept there are reasons why people don't want to talk. Whether it's shame or fear, I learned pretty early on not to be mad at my family for the things they didn't want to talk about.
And we'll also discuss a complicated relationship between Jewishness, humor, and alienation through Franz Kafka's America.
Reading America, I was just like, there's something, I don't know, like, you understand that the world is weird and cruel and strange. And as a Jew, you're kind of carrying this, like, thing. We're like the sort of the keepers of the flame. Like, we've literally seen and gone through every terrible, weird, absurd, crazy experience you could go through, and he just kind of distills it into this like kind of funny fever dream. When I read America for the first time, that's when I truly understood Kafka as a Jewish writer, and to me, the Jewish writer.
All that and more coming up next. And stay tuned after the show for a short one-book moment, a book selection from a friend of the podcast. This time, it's literary insider Erica Dreyfus. Welcome to The 5 Books. Jason, I'm so happy to have you here today. We're here to talk about Kaplan's Plot. I also want to tell you how much I enjoy your Instagram presence.
Thank you. It's been a nice evolution on there.
Yeah, it's really fun. But back to Kaplan's Plot. This book, it looks like a gangster novel on the surface. Very quickly, it reveals itself about what gets passed down, and that's the pun of the title there. It's about trauma and silence and loyalty and moral compromise, and I just really appreciated how psychologically specific the characters are. Even when they're doing terrible things, you really understand the emotional logic behind them. So I'd love to start by asking you what kind of book you thought you were writing when you set out to write it.
That's a really good question. To be totally honest, and I don't mean to like kind of like echo a lot of like the mid-century Jewish writers who many of us probably grew up reading, like Roth and Bellow and Grace Paley, and writers who wanted to be, I'm an American writer, or I'm an American Jewish writer, or an American who's a Jew, or a Jew who's an American. But to me, it was an American book. You know, it's a lot of people said it's a Jewish novel and it's a gangster novel and it's a Chicago novel, and I'll take all of those things. But to me, I think I was really trying to distill my own thoughts and feelings and beliefs into not just the Jewish American experience, but I think the larger immigrant experience in America. throughout the generations, and I wanted to, if somebody whose family came from Haiti or from China or from Mexico or from wherever read the book, they would be able to relate to it. The fact that it's Jewish is because I'm Jewish, and I wanted to write an American book.
Book 1, A Jewish Book from Childhood. Mouse, by Art Spiegelman. I guess if you could just start by telling us a little bit about what your household was like, Jewishly and otherwise, when you were a kid.
A lot of Kaplan's plot is based on mostly my mom's family, but like a lot of things I saw from both sides of my family. But my mom's family, they were in Chicago. Now they're all in Florida, but they'd been in Chicago throughout the 20th century. I like to joke we were a cheeseburgers at the bar mitzvah family. We were Reform synagogue. Both my grandparents and my mom spoke Yiddish. My mom didn't speak it as well as they did. But the Jewish culture and like the last remnants of that old world were still sort of in our lives. At the same time, my mom's family is very Chicago, which to me, it's funny because, growing up there, and, I've lived in New York longer, but growing up there, I was very aware of the fact that the American Jewish story is sort of filtered through the East Coast, New York writers and creators. The Chicago Jewish experience, I think, is a lot different because it's still working class. Chicago, I think things are a little bit more closed off. So the Jewish community, just like every other community, kind of are in their own little places. But we go to synagogue 3 times a year, but we don't eat pork in the house, like stuff like that. And my dad's family, grandparents are Holocaust survivors. My dad was born in a DP camp. They didn't really want to talk about any of that stuff. And I kind of understood why from an early age, but what I didn't understand was why my mom's family didn't want to talk about their past. And that's how we kind of get to me writing a story about Jewish gangsters in Chicago.
Do you now know that story from your mom?
A lot of it I had to piece together. I mean, it started years and years ago when, my mom and my nana were sitting at the kitchen table, and I think I was in like 2nd grade maybe. And I had to ask, I was like, so I have to do a report on where our family comes from. And my nana goes, we're Jewish. And I'm like, okay, but where do we come from? She's like, we come from Chicago. And I was like, what? And so I've always lived in, until I moved to the suburbs when I was a little older, I grew up in Chicago proper. So I was around, I'd see Black kids and Hispanic kids and Indian kids and Korean kids and kids from all over. So I was like, oh, when we go to class, everyone is from somewhere, and they knew where their families came from or where they came from. And then years later, I just kind of casually asked my nana, I'm like, I know your parents were like dry cleaners and tailors, that whole thing. And she's like, yeah. She didn't want to give up too much. And then I'll never forget, she goes, but my dad was Al Capone's tailor. And I was like, oh, that's cool. She didn't really tell you anything else. And years later, I was reading some like really silly, I don't know. I found it at some like school used book thing when I was visiting Chicago. But I think it was like Kosher Nostra or something like that. And it was like some self-published book about the Jewish gangsters of Chicago and the Jewish underworld of Chicago. And there's this picture of this guy named Yitzhak Levitz. But I'm like, oh, I had a great uncle with that name. And I flipped to the next page, and there's a picture of Yitzhak Levitz, who drove trucks full of booze from the border by Detroit down to Chicago with his brother's dry cleaning trucks. And his brother was my great-grandfather. And my great-grandfather wasn't a gangster, and neither was Yitzhak, but they needed money. They were poor. They were immigrants, they did anything they could to make extra money. And so that just sort of started this thing in my head where I'm like, there's such a fine line between needing money and needing more, and like wanting more. And there's also a fine line between doing something that isn't right because it's going to help you, and then doing something illegal because it's going to help you. And they did, but it's kind of that fine line they walked. They did stuff that was illegal. I can't really be mad at that because I'm here and I'm able to write books and have the life I have, which they could only have dreamed of.
So tell me about Mouse and when you read it.
So really, this is a funny story, actually. I met Art Spiegelman like 2 months ago. He was at the Miami Book Festival, and I just went up to him, and I never do this, but I had to tell him, I'm like, I read Mouse when I was 8 years old. This is a very like late 1980s kind of childhood experience. I feel like now they wouldn't let an 8-year-old kid read Mouse, I think. But he looked at me like, I wouldn't have let you read that book. And he was like vaping the whole time. He's a funny guy. I read it because I'd seen it around and it was in my school library. And I'm like, oh, it's a comic. That's cool. I like comics. I was obsessed with comics. My mom taught me very early on about the Holocaust. Like when I was like 6, she explained it to me because the town that I was born in had a statue dedicated to like partisan fighters that saved Jews. And it was like people had scrawled all kinds of anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi stuff on it. My mom took me to see it. And she took me home and explained it all to me. And she was like, people don't like us. There's a lot of people who aren't liked because of who they are, whether it was black people or gay people or whatever, immigrants. But, at that moment, she's like, there are people who don't like us because of who we are. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense to me. I'm 5, 6, whatever. And then she showed me The Producers by Mel Brooks, which was, I don't know why. I think she was trying to buffer things a little bit. So, I kind of understood this very early on. And she told me, like, your grandparents were in the Holocaust. Like, I didn't understand, like, what they were in the Holocaust meant. So a couple of years later, I was so preoccupied with it. And I remember I picked up this book and I'm like, this is, first of all, it's a very dark, obviously dark, violent book, but I just remember kind of understanding right away that Art Spiegelman, he only learns things like through drips and drabs when he's younger. And they don't really want to talk about anything, the parents. Later on he gets to ask his dad, and that's how we get the story, and his dad's opening up. But it's like, it's just so heartbreaking. And it felt, even then, and when I reread it today, it's still the same thing. I'm like, my family didn't want to talk about any of this stuff. They didn't want to talk about any of the past. They didn't want to talk about what they experienced. And what I learned came in drips and drabs. And reading Mouse at such an early age, even if I would have read it later, it would have been the same thing, I think. But it just kind of made me understand sort of early on, like, I have to be willing to accept there are reasons why people don't want to talk and why people stay silent about things. And whether it's shame or fear or whatever, I learned pretty early on not to be mad at my family for the things they didn't want to talk about, which kind of like shaped my worldview in a lot of ways that I wouldn't have expected a comic of any sort to do. And I'm just very grateful that it exists.
Did you eventually learn your father's family's story?
I had to piece it together. I think my dad, like, it'd be like random things. Like, I know my grandfather and his 2 brothers and they survived. And then I'm like, what happened to the rest of the family? And they all died. I'm like, when? Was it during? He's like, most of it. Yeah. Mostly during the Holocaust. I'm like, okay. And then, a couple of years later, they casually mentioned like one of the family members who got sent to Siberia instead and died in Siberia. And I'm like, oh, so we had family who Stalin killed as well. Okay, great. That's nice. But, you would learn things like that. And I remember he was wonderful. My great uncle, my grandfather's brother, Alec, who was just this lovely, always happy, like, like laughing all the time, just so full of joy. And he owned a candy store, which I always think is like, oh, that's the sweetest thing. He owned a candy store. He was always, and I remember years ago just bringing him up to my dad, who I've never had a close relationship with either of my parents, but I brought up Uncle Alec and I was like, man, he was the nicest guy I think I've ever met. And my dad just gets really, just kind of looks this distant look in his eye. He's like, that guy killed so many Nazis. And I was like, what? I was like, wait, what? And he's like, yeah. Oh, I never told you about this? I'm like, no. He was like, well, yeah. Oh, Uncle Alec, ran off. I think he ended up in Poland. They were Romanian. I think he was in Poland. He hid under houses, ends up in Poland somewhere, ends up a partisan fighter. And he basically was willing to suicide bomb trains with Nazis on them. Like, he would run as the train was coming. They would run under and plant the dynamite, because they didn't have they just had to light it, and he would put it on the train tracks and run as fast as he could and hope he didn't get blown up or shot or whatever. And yeah, he'd blow up trains full of Nazis. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. I did not know that. So you learn stuff like that. And I'm like, I wish you would have told me that when I was 10 and kids were, calling me all kinds of anti-Semitic slurs and stuff, because I would have felt a lot tougher.
What an incredible story.
Yeah. So it's just stuff like that. And then finding out where my grandmother was held, and, kind of piecing together, I remembered, I thought I knew what camp my grandfather was in, and my dad's like, no, Grandpa wasn't there. He was at another one. And I have it written down somewhere, but and then he escaped. I'm like, he escaped? So you just kind of hear these things, and it's just this weird thing over the years. I just keep learning things. Even 3 months ago, I learned more about my family that went to Siberia or was, thrown into Siberia. It's crazy. Just always learning this stuff.
Book 2, A Jewish Book from Adulthood. America, by Franz Kafka. So before we talk about America itself, can you situate Kafka Jewishly for listeners? And there's lots of debate about how to read Kafka in terms of his Jewish identity. So I wonder how you understand that conversation.
So it's funny. I look at him from a totally bizarre light. I have this theory, and it's very cockamamie until you hear it. And then when I say it, I always have to I always go, ugh, because it's it sounds kind of weird the way I say it, but I'm obsessed with this idea of Jews who are astrologically cancers. Are you?
Yeah.
So same here. So you read into what a cancer is supposed to be. I like astrology, but you get us, obviously. You get Mel Brooks. You get Bruno Schultz, who's another great, he's the Polish equivalent to Kafka. You get Larry David, Richard Lewis, Marcel Proust, Walter Benjamin, Anthony Bourdain, Neil Simon. You get all these you kind of put them all together, and you're like, huh, that's a very specific, these are kind of some funny, weird, dark, strange, emotional, outsidery. They all kind of have their own way of feeling like taking the outsider perspective and Kafka. And I'm so very proud of the fact that I'm a Jewish cancer, which I assume plenty of anti-Semitic groups would also label me as, but he's just a very emotional, repressed, he didn't live that long, but he's never comfortable in his own skin. Obviously, the Metamorphosis, is his most famous story. And you have a guy who literally wakes up as a bug. And it's what? Read into that a little bit. It's just he felt pretty, he was from a German-speaking Jewish family in Prague, which I think they were considered outsiders. That community was a little outsidery. There's just so much about him that's people are oh, he was neurotic, he was a hypochondriac, all those funny stereotypes that, you don't want to say, yeah, I've seen a lot of that in my family and in my peer group, but they do kind of play into the Jewish experience a little bit, I guess. But he just, to me, kind of crystallized so much, just feeling like the other, he just didn't seem to feel comfortable in society. And it wasn't like he was antisocial. It was that he was very acutely aware of the fact that he was Jewish. He was German-speaking Jew. He was just an odd duck in general. He had that very strained relationship with his father. And all of these things, I think, kind of just play into, like, when I read him early on as a kid, I just automatically picked up on him. Like, I feel very, like, I don't write like him, but I feel like I've got a kindred spirit here. And I've just loved him since I was, a teenager. I just always go back to him. And he's funny. People think, oh, he's so dark and bleak and this and that. I'm like, well, life is dark and bleak. And I think he was an absurdist.
What made you choose this book? And, the question was sort of how it impacted your Jewish identity. So curious to hear about that.
I read it a little later on, and I'd read enough of his stories. I'd read The Castle, and I'd read, a lot of his stuff. And I think America was like his last work that it took me a while to get to. And when I read it, it was just like a revelation, because it was like it's his funniest book. There's like a lot of little autobiographical details, even though he had never gone to America. He never even left Europe. I don't know. To me, it just felt so like, this is going to sound funny, but it's like the same feeling I get when I watch Curb Your Enthusiasm, where I'm like, I kind of get where Larry's coming from, and I don't know what that says about me, because he's supposed to be the jerk, but reading America, I was just like, there's something, I don't know, like, you understand that the world is weird and cruel and strange, and as a Jew, you're kind of carrying this like thing that's like, we're like the sort of the keepers of the flame. Like, we've literally seen and gone through every terrible, weird, absurd, crazy experience you could go through, and he just kind of distills it into this like kind of funny fever dream about the immigrant experience that he'd never even experienced. And there's just something so, I don't know, it's just like the cleverness to me is like it just appealed to me, because I've always loved, when I was a kid, people would always say, oh, you're so clever, Jason. Like when I moved to like the very not Jewish part of the Chicagoland area, like it was like, you talk fast, you're a smart ass, or you're very clever. And then it was, you remind me of Jerry Seinfeld. That was another one. But when I read America for the first time, I was like, that's when I truly understood Kafka as a Jewish writer, and to me, the Jewish writer in so many ways.
It's interesting that you started talking about how you see your own book as like an American book, and you just happen to be Jewish, and I see echoes of that and kind of how you're talking about. I wonder how you see those yourself and how you think about yourself as a writer versus a Jewish writer in terms of Kafka.
Yeah, it's funny, because I think part of the reason I shy away from generally just being like Jewish writer, Jewish book, Jewish this, it's not because I don't like those labels, but I feel like I decided to, I don't want to say be Jewish, but I decided to keep going instead of just being like, I'm just going to immerse myself. I was always going to marry a Jewish person. I was like, I have to, like, I want to raise my child Jewish. I want to do there's like certain things that like I had to come to on my own for whatever reason, because I'm not a religious person. It's just like, it's like one of those things where it's like, I've always felt weird when people tell me they're a vegetarian, but they eat fish, and I didn't. So that's what I kind of felt like, if I'm going to say, oh, I'm a Jewish writer, it's like, well, I don't keep Shabbos. I don't keep kosher. I mean, I don't eat pork, but if you give me an oyster, I'll eat it, and it's like, so it's like, I just don't feel comfortable. It's just like, also like the other one, when a guy says he's a feminist, I'm like, I can't say that, because it's not mine to say. It's like, feminism is a movement for women, by women. It's like that kind of thing. I just, I don't want to overstep my boundaries. I don't want anybody to think that I'm representative of something I'm not, because I'm my own person, and my Judaism and Jewishness is a personal thing, because that's just who I am.
Book 3, A Book That Changed Your Worldview. Be Here Now by Ram Dass. This has not come up yet. super excited to hear about. So tell me why you chose this book and when you encountered it.
I read it when I was very young. I would say 16, 17. And it's funny because at that point, I was sort of left to my own devices as a teenager. Like, my parents weren't very involved in my life when I was a teenager. When I was 15, 16, my dad had already lost custody of me a few years earlier. I hadn't seen him in like 3 or 4 years. And then my mom just up and left. And so I was sort of left on my own to finish school, to get a job, to do all these things. And I didn't have much supervision. I didn't have any religious upbringing. I didn't have anything. I just kind of would walk a lot, and I'd go to punk rock shows. I'd skateboard, but I was always really filled with this kind of longing for really just trying to understand the world and the universe and all those things that we go through and we'll never be able to fully understand. I don't remember how I came to it, but I just remember some interview with some musician I liked. They mentioned it. So I found it. It was at some library, and I remember I just started reading it. It's a weird book to begin with, the way it's laid out, but the more I'd kind of just kind of keep reading through it, reading through it, I'm something is working here for me, and I can't really understand. And I'm not really into Eastern spirituality. I do yoga, not like he did yoga. There's just something about the title that right there. I was be here now. I've never really been good at that. I've never I had to really think about that. And then, a few years later, I read something about the Ram Dass, and I was like, wait a minute. He was Jewish? His name was Richard Alpert? And all of a sudden it started really, I don't know, something. I went and got another copy. I bought a used copy. And I was reading it from, I don't want to say the Jewish perspective, but from my perspective. I'm oh, okay, I kind of understand this a little bit more. And then the more I'd read it and think about it, the more I'm oh, I kind of get why he went on this experience. Part of it was drugs. I remember years later reading, towards the later part of his life, Ram Dass, I don't want to say he got back into Judaism, but he started reading more. He started studying Talmud, I think. He wasn't Orthodox by any means, but he started kind of understanding how his own upbringing and his background really did play into who he was. And it wasn't just this orthodoxy. He could take what was inherently inside of him and put it into his daily practice. And I think there's something beautiful about that. He evolved by kind of going back. And I tell myself, I'm one day, I've tried studying Talmud. I'm maybe one day I'll start to kind of understand why these things sustained my ancestors, and that's just sort of a journey that I can really appreciate. And so it's more the journey that Be Here Now, ironically, put me on. Always try to be here now, center yourself. I meditate. I've had a pretty strong meditation practice for 20 years almost. It just taught me a lot about myself, and that there's room to grow and room to have a lot of different ideas and still be Jewish.
Yeah, everything that you're saying makes so much sense of, learning to value the present, especially when what you're talking about in your Jewish experience is so much about trying to understand history and make sense of the past. And that's so much of what Judaism is reliving and experiencing our collective past. So that tension makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much tragedy, obviously, but there's just so much beauty too.
Book 4, the book you're reading now, Gods of New York by Jonathan Mahler and Effingers by Gabriella Turgid.
Just wrapped up Gods of New York by Jonathan Mahler, which is a nonfiction book. I love New York books. It's just a history of the, most fascinating little eras in the city's history. And he just does such a great job of telling the story. And also, I know I wasn't only, but I've just been reading this for the last 2 months. It's Effingers by Gabriel Turgit, and I love German Jewish stuff. And this is it's never been translated into English, and I've just been eating this up in every sense of the word. It's fascinating. It's one of the best novels of this size I've ever. I'm actively happy I'm reading a very big book right now.
Book 5, the author's latest book, Kaplan's Plot by Jason Diamond. As we're talking, I'm thinking about all of these through lines also from your nonfiction, like absent adults, self-reliant kids, especially boys learning to be men via the culture around them. What brings you back to that idea?
I mean, personal experience. Like I said, going back to the be or nothing and always evolving and always being conscious of the past. I think something I've learned is when you repress the past, when you don't let the past, your own personal past, play a part in your growth or your future, you're doing a great disservice to yourself. And so, I think a lot of what I've written, my first book was a memoir, and for a while I was really on the fence about writing that because I didn't want to write a memoir. That wasn't what I had pitched. I'd pitched a different kind of book, but the editor who bought it was like, I want a memoir. Now I'm really grateful I wrote it because writing is I've been seeing therapists for a long time, but it's to me, writing is the most therapeutic thing. And being able to sort of figure out new ways to sort of contextualize or play with that experience is, it's made me more confident. It's made me happy. It's made me just more appreciative of myself. A lot of things. If you read my writing or you keep track of it, you're basically watching a therapy session in real time. And I should be paying people who read me because they're basically shrinks at this point.
Which leads me to my next question, which is that I know you had your daughter right around the time that you were writing this book. And again, you're talking so much about these painful absences from your life. And I wonder how that impacted the telling of the story.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. We sold the book 2 weeks before she was born. So a lot of it was written while my wife was pregnant, which, it's its own experience in itself. Watching my wife my wife and I have been together. It's crazy. She's 7 years younger than me, but we've been together closing in on 20 years, I think 17 this year. And I find new reasons to fall in love with her every day. But watching her for those 9 months, I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. I can't believe how she's doing this. I can't believe how much we don't appreciate women doing this. Can't believe how much we don't appreciate human life because somebody has to do this all the time. So I was writing the book through that kind of crazy, just oh my God. Women, have you heard of them? Not like that. But what I'm saying? I was kind of, I just never really had a reason to sort of, I never got to watch the 9 full months of somebody carrying a baby and having to be there with them and think about that at every moment. And it just blew my mind the more I thought about how insane and incredible and beautiful and scary and everything that is. And then I finished the book 2 months before she was born, I think. I did the editing of the book as a new parent, and the only thing that changed between the draft that I sold and the finished product, I guess, is I really started to understand Eve's point of view more. The parents, I understood, specifically Eve, but I understood the conflicts. My wife likes to point out that I'm a very insanely empathetic person. Sometimes it's too much. I'm oh my God, I could just, this person, I can't, the energy is so sad or so angry or so whatever. But I find that I can apply that empathy to fictional characters, which I'm very grateful for. But without having that experience of being a parent, even a little bit, not a mother, but still just a new parent, sort of like just whipped me into this like thinking. I'm like, I have to be a little bit more understanding of her point of view, because up until that point, my experience with my own parents was like, yeah, they were kind of not best parents. They've even admitted that they were not great parents. Yeah, that wasn't what I was doing with her, and I needed to work on that a little bit.
Now that you say it, she's such a richly drawn character. I can see all of those things making her way into the character.
Like both of my parents are in evil. I think I was putting sort of my trying to understand and sympathize with my parents in their own mishigas, I guess. And, my mom has her own stuff and my dad definitely has his own stuff. I thought a lot about like my mom definitely has inherited trauma like we all do. If you're Jewish, if you come from any culture or group of people that has that, you probably inherited trauma. But I thought a lot also about my dad, who's a very screwed up person. God bless him, but he's a mess. Like, he's always been a mess. I can smile and kind of laugh about it a little bit now because my brother and I joke about it all the time. But I remember reading this Elie Wiesel quote years ago about like, I'm gonna misquote him, but it was to the effect of like, don't mourn for us or feel sorry for us, the survivors. Feel sorry for our kids because they're the ones who are going to inherit all of this. And when I read that, it really had an impact on me because I started thinking a lot about a lot of the children of Holocaust survivors and also like survivors of Stalin's Russia or any human-made catastrophe. It's their kids who just like they inherit so much of that, like the terror that they couldn't understand. And my dad, that's what he got. He was their first kid and he grew up, he was born to lose basically because his parents didn't know how to deal with what they had experienced and they just pushed it onto him and he didn't know how to, fix himself or didn't know how to talk about it and, the repression. So, yeah.
It's interesting because you go back to the locus of that trauma by opening the story with Yitzhak and his brother Saul witnessing a pogrom, basically,
Yep.
and this terrible violence. And you feel for these two tiny children who are then sent off to America on their own and just completely have to fend for themselves. And yet they respond to that trauma in two totally different ways, which you then continue to explore throughout the book. And Yitz is, really only able to see things transactionally. Even, I would argue that maybe his relationship with his brother is a bit tainted.
Yeah.
I'm just curious how you got into that psychological headspace or what was important to you about portraying these very different responses to trauma.
Again, I think it is just like I wrote a lot from the point of view, just like for my own sake, from the point of view of each character. I just tried to write like a day in their life or dialogue that I would never even use. Just like try to kind of get into their headspace, almost the way like I feel like an actor would like take a character, like method acting sort of. I don't know. It was like a weird thing where with Yitz and Saul, I always kind of had this, like, I don't want to say like Cain and Abel sort of like two different paths, but it is sort of like that because I've always liked that story. But I also just like with Yitz, it was so natural. It was like, go to a whole new place. You have nothing, no friends, no family there. All you have is one opportunity, and that opportunity is, crime. And then Saul, I don't know. I that was a little harder because I didn't want it to be cheesy. He's not educated. I think he's a pretty deep thinker. I don't think he's an idiot. Like people take him for an idiot because he's quieter, I think. But to me, it was like he's like more connected to the earth. Like he's like there's something. I'm looking for something a little bit more natural and a little bit more. I want to get back to what my father did and be a butcher. I want to have a family and I want to have these things. And I think those are actually human impulses. Like, I think we're so detached from that these days where it's like, oh, I have to become an influencer or I have to get social media likes or I have to do this or I have to. But, I think it's very natural to be like, I want to just a nice life. I want to live a peaceful existence, and I don't know what that is, but I'm going to try to do it. And that's what I think Saul was reaching for. And Yitz, it's all chaos. Like his whole mind is chaos.
Yeah, and then that reverberates through the generations. Yeah. I guess I just want to go back to this idea of, a Jewish writer, a Jewish story. It just, to me, it feels so much like this Jewish story is so much of the American Jewish story. Like, that maybe the Orthodox version is a much smaller slice of the Jewish American story. Mm-hmm. So I totally understand it as an American story, an immigrant story, but I do think it's a Jewish story. Yeah. And wonder if you see it through that lens at all.
I guess maybe I said it wrong, because I definitely, if it's coming from me, it's a Jewish story. What I think I was trying to get at was more, it's the American as a Jew and the Jew as an American sort of thing. The way I look at it, like, unless your family was like German aristocracy or Dutch aristocracy who came to America, and you have that lineage of like rich family, and your family's always been rich and kind of taken care of and haven't had to worry about much, then I think you're kind of out of this conversation. But pretty much everybody in America, it doesn't matter if you came to America or your family was brought here unwillingly, or your family was here and then they were pushed out like native people. Everybody is here and has that trauma sort of seeded in us, whether it was you come from famine or war. And that to me is why it's an American book. I was really trying hard to make that point. It's not the whole Shylock thing where do I not bleed? Like, it's not, I'm not trying to like be like, hey, I'm a person just like you. I'm literally just like, hey, we are all the same kind of in a lot of ways. My culture is different than yours. My upbringing was probably different than yours. A lot of these things, but you come from something and I come from something, and it wasn't great. And the fact that we're here is this beautiful thing, and we should not only just celebrate that, but also appreciate each other more. Knowing that, as corny as this is going to sound, is like, we're all kind of miracles, because my family were literally, they survived pogroms, the Holocaust, Stalin, like all of those things just in like 100 years. Who knows what they were going through even before, or what they had to escape, given the Jewish experience. But that's like, the fact that I'm here is like 0.1% chance. I just don't get it. And I feel like that's a lot of people. And so I just wanted to make that point. That's why I think it's the American thing is very important. But I've always internalized a Jew's place in the world and the things we've always had to deal with. Anti-Semitism is back, quote unquote. And I don't disagree with that. But like, I grew up, I lived in Northern Illinois. There was a guy with a Nazi flag in his front yard until the cops made him take it down. But like, I went to school with that guy's kid, and he would write like Sieg Heil on his shoes, and like kids drew a swastika on my locker once. And people, I remember back, I told the principal, he was like, well, they're just messing around. We'll just wash it off. We'll just clean it off your locker. And I was like, clean off my locker? These dudes wrote a swastika on my, it's like, so I've always internalized and thought about the Jew's place in the world, and how, I don't want my kids or your kids or anybody's kids to have to feel what I felt or what my father or mother felt or but it's hard not to, because the stuff gets passed down or it gets experienced. And yeah, so that's, I think, one of the larger themes of the book is Yitz, he's carrying that sort of burden where even though he's a criminal and he's a murderous person and whatever, he still has this terrible fear that bad things are going to happen because he's Jewish. And because, there's a scene where he's trying to give the rabbi of the local shul guns because he's like, they're going to come for us. And, my wife and I are here in 2025 currently being like, should we get our dual citizenship just in case? I grew up my grandfather and father always had bags packed, literally just in case. My grandfather hid guns around the house just in case. So it's like, that's a terrible burden. And that to me, if anything, is why, it is a Jewish book, because I think every culture has their way of dealing with these things, but I think Jews have hundreds and thousands of years of it. So it's a unique sort of trauma.
Yeah, the book ends on a hopeful note with this feeling that people can make their own way from that trauma and create something good from all of that. So just maybe tell us what feels most meaningful to you about your Jewish identity right now.
I mean, it's going to go back to my child, my daughter, my baby. She's 20 months old, and not to get too into I don't want to get into the politics of this, but we were having a discussion with, we're probably going to be sending her to a Jewish school. And, we were just curious, like, what's the political atmosphere? I'm just going to say there's the saying, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And I was like, we don't want to be affiliated with anywhere, because it's like, we don't want to get into the politics of things, like, because we have nuanced beliefs, we like to think. And we like to be open to, like, discussing things instead of, emailing and texting or tweeting or whatever, how stupid people and bad people are. But we were having a conversation with the principal of the school, and they said something that was really, beautiful. And they were like, we're not running away from anything, because everything is real. Like, things, whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's Israel, whether it's Palestine, whatever, these things are real. This is our world. And if we don't have people who are for and against certain things and who want to be open to discussing things, and then we don't have change. I say this in the book. The larger thing to me that I love about being Jewish is that it's just this ongoing conversation. It's an eternal conversation. And, to me, that idea of eternity and that idea of, like, this expansiveness we can't understand plays into the religious side of things, whether it's like Talmudic discussion that keeps going, or whether it's Einstein's ideas of the universe. All these things kind of, we just don't understand how large these conversations and how important they can be. And the fact that we're still able to, like, talk like that somebody could just say, hey, we want to be able to make sure that our kids are going to be somewhere where there's conversation happening. We don't have to agree. We don't have to disagree. We don't have to, but we're just going to keep talking. That to me is like, okay, good. We're going to keep talking. Like, that's it. Nothing's ever even close to perfect. But, we're trying to raise Lulu, my daughter, in an environment where she's, like, appreciative of beauty and understanding that there's, like, sadness and horrors and ugliness and things that she'll have to experience, but there's always going to be beauty. And you can always rely on that. Hearing that there's always going to be discussion is beautiful to me, and it gives me hope. And I'm the most hopeful person. Like, I wish I was more cynical. Like, my wife is like, I don't get it. What the heck? And I'm like, I don't know. It's a combination, being Jewish and, that the ingrained, I'm waiting for the Messiah to come, / my mom's family are all Chicago sports fans, and you're just waiting for a good team to come along. Like, it's going to happen this year. This year is the year. Like, that's just my whole life. And I'm very hopeful. I don't know. I shouldn't be, but I am.
It's a beautiful combination of the Mouse, Kafka, Be Here Now. And that's how we get to Kaplan Spot. So this was a great conversation.
It all came together.
Thank you. It did. It all came together. And thank you so much for such a generous conversation.
Thank you so much. No, I really appreciate it.
Appreciate the book even more. I hope everyone will read it if they haven't. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me.
Before we go, we have a special extra, a one-book moment, if you will, to share with you today. From time to time, we'll bring you a short standalone selection from a friend of the podcast, a quick listen meant to spark curiosity and send you back to the books. This selection is from Erica Dreyfus. Erica is a reader, writer, teacher, and literary advocate. She's the editor and publisher of The Practicing Writer, a free and popular e-newsletter that features opportunities and resources for fiction writers, poets, and writers of creative nonfiction. And also the Machberet blog, where she shares Jewish literary links. We'll share a link to her website in the show notes. Enjoy!
Hello, I am Erica Dreyfus. I have been a fan of the 5 books since the podcast launched, and I've actually been envious of everyone who's been invited to share titles. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity to participate this way. I'm going to focus on a Jewish book from childhood that helped shape my identity, meaning, of course, my Jewish identity. This is a book that belonged to my dad as a little boy. It's called Habibi and Yao, A Little Boy and His Dog, by Althea O. Silverman, with illustrations by Jesse B. Robinson. My copy, or was my dad's copy, is from the second printing in 1948 from the Bloch Publishing Company, which apparently had a tagline of The Jewish Book Concern. The title characters, Habibi and Yao, are indeed a little boy and his dog, respectively. The book opens, just before Shabbos, one Friday in April, a wee little boy was born. His parents were very happy. They asked all their relatives to come and see the dear little baby. As the little boy grows, the book takes us through his Jewish upbringing, including holidays both major and minor, as well as rituals and customs. The book's final pages include a glossary. All of this taught me a lot before I learned it elsewhere. For instance, in a chapter titled Habibi Goes to Hebrew School, the little boy is served honey cake at breakfast. His mother explains the custom of consuming sweets as one begins to study the language in which the Torah is written. And yes, the dog, Yao, gets a honey cake of his own too, because it's been agreed that the little boy will share what he learns with his favorite companion, who unfortunately isn't allowed into the classroom. So many of my earliest encounters with nuggets of Jewish identity and knowledge came through this book. And of course, the memory of reading it in my grandparents' home, just as my father had done before me, only reinforces the attachment that I have to it and the value that I place on it as a Jewish book from my childhood. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for joining us today for the 5 books. Our guest today was Jason Diamond talking about his book, Kaplan's Plot. You can find a link to the book and all the others Jason discussed in our show notes. If you've read one of the wonderful books recommended on our show, we'd love to hear about it. Drop us a comment on our Instagram at 5bookspod or in our email, team@5bookspod.org. If you'd like an email reminder to keep you up to date with new episodes, plus links to all the books we discussed directly in your inbox, you can sign up for our newsletter in the show notes or on our website, 5bookspod.org. I'm Tali Rosenblatt-Cohen. Our producer is Odelia Rubin. Editorial and website support from Amelia Merrill. Music by Dove Rosenblatt and Blue Dot Sessions. Art by Elad Lifshitz of the Dove Abramson Studio. Thanks especially to the Jewish Book Council.